I'm going to surprise you all today. I'm going to tell a story. Hmm, go figure. The story is about this. Many years ago, Nancy, well, I would use the word summoned me, but actually she invited me to go with her to an exhibit of quilts. I I wasn't all that excited about it, I must admit. A number of years before that, we went to Oregon one time for a vacation, and they had a state fair, and we went into a big exhibit hall where they were having quilts. And I must admit, they were amazing. They really were. The intricacy, the perfection, if you will, the colors, everything was first class, so to speak. And they were wonderful. And I felt like I had done my duty and I would never need to go see quilts again. Nothing against quilts. I just want to make that perfectly clear. But that was okay. So when she asked me, this was when we were in California, she said, let's go to the DeYoung Museum of Art in San Francisco. There's a special exhibit I'd like to see. And maybe you're familiar with this. It's the Gee's Bend quilts.
Oh,
If you've ever heard of the quilts of Gee's Bends, that it's quite a story. We went there and I started learning more about what had happened. These quilts started in 1930, and there is a place called Gee's Bend, Alabama. It's just a hop, skip, and a jump south of Selma, Alabama. The occupants there, about 700, were all descendants of slaves that worked at the Petway plantation. This little area is surrounded on three different sides by the Alabama River. It's off by itself for all practical purposes. But in 1930, things went from bad to almost impossible. Over the years, since their quote unquote freedom, there had been one family that had helped them in their sharecropping, and they offered credit to these people that were desperately trying to survive. And they offered credit for food, for tools, for animals, just so they could make a life. But in 1930, the owner, the father, died, and his family took over. And they had no interest in giving any more credit which typically was maybe repaid, maybe not. But the father understood what was at risk. This was a white family that owned the merchant store. And the family, though, took over and they started deciding they were going to recoup their losses by whatever means possible. Well, the families, the sharecroppers, the blacks, they did not have any money. So they started taking their food. They started taking their tools. They started taking their animals. They would have died completely if it wasn't for Red Cross coming in and giving emergency rations. But that still didn't get them where they could even survive. So in 1930, the women of Gee's Bend started making quilts. Now, these quilts were not in the same category, if you will, from the ones from the Oregon State Fair, but in much more ways, they were more beautiful. Because you see, they couldn't go to the store and get a pattern, or they couldn't decide this symbol, this pattern, whatever. No, they had to take whatever they could, again, because of survival. Because these shacks that they lived in, they had no heat, they had no water, they had no electricity, they had nothing. So if they were going to survive, they needed some protection. They started making blankets by starting to make quilts. They made quilts from anything and everything they could find: rags, discarded work clothes, feed bags, any kind of material that they could find. they used. And they wove together some amazingly intricate designs. There was a lot of color. These sometimes weren't perfectly rectangle. They weren't always the seamless seams. There were some challenges, but yet you could see how much effort they had put into these quilts. They became well known because not of their story alone, but because of these quilts. So a couple of years ago, Nancy invited me once again to go to the Philadelphia Museum of Art where the exhibit was being held. I went gladly this time, just to once again see that story, once again to see those quilts and understand what had happened for those quilts to be made. At the San Francisco Museum, though, I saw something else. Part of the exhibit, I saw a painting. It was a rather large painting, and it was depicting a baptism, most likely in the Alabama River, most likely of some people who lived in that area. But the picture depicted on the shore, there were the family members, some of the church members, and in the river itself was the pastor, the preacher, and one woman, a young woman, maybe in her 20s or her 30s. She wasn't a kid, but a young woman, and it showed her coming out of the water. I vividly remember her expression. The painting was big enough that you could see very clearly. And I don't know whether the painter, the artist, meant for this to be the takeaway from it. But when I saw her face, when I looked upon it, it was startling. Her face had this, and I know I can't really do a good job of portraying what her face looked by just words, but her face had a combination of both being overwhelmed and filled with hope and optimism. Now, the overwhelmed part, that could be a lot of things. It could be because the water was cold in the river. I mean, that's always a possibility. But it also could be that she was understanding now as a child of God. The tradition would have been a baptism meant you had new life. It meant so much to her. Maybe overwhelmed because when she came out of the water, she saw the same people, the same situation, the same desperation. And it hit her that, how do we make it through this? That feeling, that face of being overwhelmed, though, was not only matched, but it was supplemented by this other expression. And again, this is my interpretation of it. But this other expression that portrayed hope and optimism and confidence. I don't know, but I could just sense that this woman coming out of the water, in spite of being overwhelmed, she was proclaiming the 23rd Psalm. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, and that's where they lived. That was the reality of their life. And yet here she is coming out of this water, and there's a sense of hope. Many years ago, does anybody remember the singer Helen Reddy? This is back in 1971. She had a wonderful song, and that song rang with me at that moment when I saw this picture, this painting. You remember what the song was? I am woman, hear me roar. I don't know why that just kind of hit me as that's what she's singing. She's proclaiming the 23rd Psalm. She's singing, I am woman, hear me roar. In spite of being overwhelmed, in spite of having to deal with what they were dealing with, there she was. That painting, her face to me became the image of thanksgiving. Now, I'm not talking about the holiday, the one that's coming up this next week. I'm talking about the practice of thanksgiving, not something that happens once a year, but something that happens 365 days a year. It's a lifestyle of thanksgiving. And so I wanted to share with you another psalm, Psalm 95, that talks about thanksgiving. It's in verse 2, the one that says, "Let us come into God's presence with thanksgiving. Let us make a joyful noise to God with songs of praise." Last week, Michelle shared a question in her message. What does faith look like in times like these? I want to piggyback on that and ask a related question. What does Thanksgiving look like in times like these? And I want to rely on this psalm. Let us come into God's presence. Well, if you understand the Psalm 95, that was part of a section of the Psalms from pretty much Psalm 93 to 100 that were seen as hymns in the Second Temple era. The first temple had been destroyed. The Babylonian captivity and exile had happened. The culture was decimated. The temple was no more. But then they were allowed to come back and rebuild. These hymns are that of like a processional coming into the Second Temple. Can you imagine what that must have been like? Well, can you imagine what it's going to be like on someday? Someday we're going to get back together. We will meet in our own sanctuary. And can you imagine what that day is going to look like? Can you imagine that we'll be maybe on the sidewalk, getting ready and making our own processional? And maybe we'll sing this song, "Let us come into God's presence with thanksgiving. Let us make a joyful noise to God with songs of praise." Bill will let you lead us in that. And I can just imagine the excitement, the enthusiasm. Well, apply that to what was going on in this temple. Let us come into God's presence, they would sing. But you see, that's part of this scripture reading, that the word presence is really kind of neutral. If I go to my dentist in his presence, that's not necessarily a happy day for me. Maybe it's a cavity, maybe it's just teeth cleaning, or maybe it's a root canal. So the word presence doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be good, but the psalmist takes care of that. He says, in this case, let us come into God's presence with thanksgiving. And he says what that means. Let us make a joyful noise to God with songs of praise. You see, there's a difference between thanksgiving and gratitude. Gratitude, the classic definition and description is that gratitude is an internal feeling of what we have, and it's an internal response. It's a feeling. But thanksgiving, giving thanks, is an action. It's for us to act upon this gratitude that we have internally. Our external, our outward movement and action is that of thanksgiving. And so the psalmist says, let us make a joyful noise to God. Well, what happens if our voice isn't very good? Many years ago, and I think I've shared this somewhere along the line, many years ago when we were in Nampa, Idaho, we started something there. On Father's Day, of all days, we put together a men's choir. Now, we had a pretty good choir out there. Men and women, kids sometimes, different instruments. They did a really good job. And we had some good men singers, good voices, but not too many. And so our goal was to get about 30 to 40 men together on Father's Day. You know, that day when they asked Dad, what do you want to do? I'm going to play golf, going to go fishing, going to, no. This was kind of counter culture. Let's go to church and let's sing on Father's Day. Ha! What could possibly go wrong with that? Well, it was fascinating. We found the singers who really enjoy singing. They were all in. And then we started talking to some of those that, if you're watching in the sanctuary and a hymn is about to be sung, you could see the family kind of say, Dad, it's okay if you lip sync this time. It's okay if you sing very quietly. It's okay. So we had, like most of us, I'm in that category that singing is, well, it can be messy. It's the concept of not being able to carry a tune in a bucket. Well, we had the first year 35 men who we got together a couple of nights before, had practice. Oh, it was a hoot. We laughed and we had more fun, and we figured out we could sing. We could make a joyful noise. And that noise wasn't all that bad. That first Sunday of Father's Day came, and I think the women probably bought little cotton swabs for their ears. I'm not sure. And yet we made a joyful noise. We sang 3 songs and just raised the roof. We did exactly what the psalmist was talking about. Even though our voices, well, not all of them were that good. And yet together combined, it was rather amazing what happened. Well, so what happens though if our voice isn't very good? Well, that's okay. Remember in this week's weekly inspirational moments, there was that one writing that was included, said, there are days when life is about dreams and goals and brightness. And there are days that life is just putting one foot in front of the other and continue walking. And there is nothing wrong about this. You see, what these men did, even though they couldn't carry a tune in a bucket, some of them, they brought their bucket. They said, here we are. What can we do to help? Here's our bucket. Together, let's fill it up. And we did. Bill Nichols, when he was installed as the interim general minister and president of the Disciples of Christ a number of years ago, made a statement in his sermon, his message. I know I've shared this with some of you. And it's the one that still remains in my mind, the one that says, nobody has everything, and nobody has nothing. Everyone has something. This something that we have, just like the G's Bend quilters, the somethings that they had, just rags, just pieces of cloth, but their love and their compassion and their energy and their commitment, that they would make these quilts to survive. They would make these quilts to make a difference, and they did. Just like these men who came to this church in Idaho, not very well qualified to be a men's choir, and yet we did. They brought what they had, and that something was put with their love and compassion and care, and it made a difference. Well, together, you see, we bring our something, do we not? We bring that attitude of gratitude and we put it into action. We bring whatever we have, sometimes our rags, sometimes our riches, sometimes our hopes and our dreams, sometimes just being able to take that next step in front of one another. But we mix it together, we weave it together, we make a tapestry. And that's how we make a difference. We bring what we have and we create this tapestry built of love and compassion and hope and reaching out beyond us to wrap up a cold, lonely church, a cold, lonely world sometimes, and embrace them with love. The women of Gee's Bend made a difference. They're still making quilts, by the way, in case you want to know. And they're still on exhibit all over the place. Because when you hear their story, or for me, when you hear their story and see that painting, I know the power of something where we live a life of thanksgiving, where we indeed come into God's presence with thanksgiving, and we make a joyful noise to God with songs of praise. This is a song the world needs, and we are here to sing it. Amen.